On the 27th of March, 1941, the plan for the attack on the Soviet Union already lay ready on the Führer's desk in Berlin. Directive number 21, Operation Barbarossa, had been signed back in December of the previous year. The Army General Staff had already assembled divisions into marching columns, quartermasters were already counting wagons of fuel, and the date of mid-May already stood in operational documents as the point of no return, beyond which not a single day's delay was permissible. Yet, on that very morning in Belgrade, a group of Air Force officers took control of the radio station, and the regent of the kingdom, Prince Paul, was already packing his belongings to leave the country. Hitler learned of this over breakfast from an embassy telegram. By the evening of the same day, he had signed a document that crossed out half of his own schedule. Officially, it all appeared as if he had not lost a single hour.
German newspapers in April wrote of yet another lightning victory. The Balkans conquered in a matter of days. The army of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia defeated and capitulated in less than 2 weeks, the Greek front collapsing next, and the British Expeditionary Corps fleeing to the sea, abandoning equipment on the roads. Wehrmacht newsreels spliced together marching columns to triumphant fanfares and footage of columns of prisoners trudging along mountain roads. The official communiqué cited a neat, handsome figure. 11 days were required to bring an entire Balkan state to its knees. For Berlin's propaganda, this was another line in the list of lightning triumphs after Poland, France, and Norway, further proof that the German war machine knew no failures. The Ministry of Propaganda released a special documentary film where the narrator solemnly listed captured cities and trophies, artillery pieces, depots, thousands of prisoners, and never once mentioned a single figure concerning their own disrupted schedule, nor a word about how, somewhere to the east, on other maps in those same Berlin offices, the start date of a far more important war was already being rewritten. The real chronicle of those weeks looked entirely different, and it began not on the 6th of April, but earlier, with a paper Hitler signed in a rage, without even waiting for confirmed intelligence reports on what was happening in Belgrade. In Rome, the substance of this rage was not learned immediately, and far from completely. Mussolini, whose own divisions had been bogged down for half a year in the mountains of Albania, trying unsuccessfully to crush Greece alone, received from his ally only a dry notification that the operation would begin in the coming days. The Italian dictator, whose reputation was already undermined by winter failures, learned the details of the German plan almost after the fact. The Wehrmacht was saving his own campaign, but doing so on its own terms and according to its own schedule, coordinating this schedule with no one in advance. The crack between the Allies, barely noticeable in April, would become far more visible later, when the time came to divide not victories, but blame for the delays. On the 25th of March, the government of Dragiša Cvetković signed the protocol in Vienna for Yugoslavia's accession to the Tripartite Pact. Hitler considered the southern flank of the Eastern Campaign secured and was calmly preparing to finalize the last preparations for the attack on the Soviet Union. 2 days later, at night, Belgrade radio announced the overthrow of the Regency Council and the proclamation of the young King Peter II's majority. The organizers of the coup were Air Force officers led by General Dusan Simovic. Units of the Belgrade garrison loyal to him took to the streets, and the government building and radio station were seized without a single shot fired before dawn. Crowds of citizens, learning of the events in the morning, took to the streets with flags and portraits of the king, and in some districts, passers-by stopped German diplomats and spat on cars with German flags, a scene reported to Berlin in a separate telegram that same day, and which angered Hitler scarcely less than the coup itself. Formally, the new government had not even annulled the pact with Germany and attempted to send reassuring notes to Berlin. Hitler was indifferent to this. That same day, the 27th of March, at an urgent meeting with the High Command, he declared that Yugoslavia must be destroyed militarily as a state, without waiting for any declarations, notes, or diplomatic maneuvers. Directive number 25 was signed within hours of that meeting. The General Staff was given 10 days to devise an operation that, just the day before, had not existed on any planning map.
The 12th Army of General Wilhelm List, already stationed in Bulgaria to cover the future offensive against Greece, turned part of its forces toward Belgrade, right in the midst of preparations for another campaign. The 1st Panzer Group of General Ewald von Kleist, whose divisions were already listed for transfer to the border with the Soviet Union, received orders to go not east, but south, through Romania, toward the city of Nice. The 2nd Army of General Maximilian von Weichs was urgently pulled together from Austria and southern Germany, using the same railway lines that 2 weeks earlier had been loading trains for Operation Barbarossa. German railway dispatchers received the new schedule almost at the last moment, and some trains with fuel and ammunition for the Eastern Campaign had to be hastily rerouted and rescheduled, breaking the chain prepared over months.
The capacity of the Hungarian and Romanian railway sections, already limited, was now divided between 2 campaigns at once, and officers of the transport service, responsible for the troop transfer schedule to the Soviet border, received contradictory orders for weeks. Some trains were turned south right in the middle of their journey, others idled on sidings waiting for fuel that had gone to the Balkan Group. On the 6th of April, at 4:15 in the morning, the 8th Air Corps of General Wolfram von Richthofen began the operation codenamed Punishment, a massive bombardment of Belgrade without a declaration of war. Waves of bombers swept over the sleeping city for several hours straight, block by block. The National Library perished along with part of its ancient manuscripts. Yugoslav post-war sources cited a death toll of 17,000 people. Modern historians consider this figure inflated and speak of several thousand victims, but precise confirmed data still do not exist. The wartime archives in Belgrade were damaged by the very bombings they were meant to record.
The ground offensive began that same day on several fronts simultaneously. The Yugoslav army, only partially mobilized and stretched along borders thousands of kilometers long, began to disintegrate within the first 24 hours. Croatian units were defecting en masse to the German side or simply dispersing to their homes. And on the 10th of April in Zagreb, a separate Croatian state under Berlin's patronage was proclaimed. The army these men were supposed to defend was crumbling not only from shell fire, but from its own internal fracture. Kleist's tank columns encountered almost no organized resistance and advanced faster than the supply headquarters behind them could operate. The headquarters of the 2nd Yugoslav Army, responsible for the defense of Croatian lands, had effectively ceased to exist even before the German tanks arrived. Some officers of Croatian origin themselves arrested Serbian commanders and surrendered garrisons without a single shot fired. The roads to the north of the country were clogged not only with retreating columns, but also with refugees pulling carts and handcarts away from the cities bombed the day before. German staff reports from that period noted that resistance on individual sectors of the front was more incidental than organized. Individual companies fought to the last bullet where neighboring divisions had already dispersed to their homes, and communication between front headquarters was lost on the 2nd day of the war and never restored. On the 17th of April in Belgrade, representatives of what remained of the Yugoslav command signed the capitulation. The government and the king had already left the country by plane by that time. 11 days from the bombing to the capitulation. That is the very figure that entered all the victory bulletins. According to its own regimental reports, the Wehrmacht lost fewer than 1,000 men killed in the Yugoslav campaign. More than 300,000 soldiers and officers of the former Royal Army were taken prisoner. Many of them were released to their homes right on the roads by German guards just a few days later, because camps for such a number of prisoners were simply not ready, and guarding hundreds of thousands of men in the midst of preparations for a far more important campaign made no sense. Simultaneously with the fall of Belgrade, General List's troops were already biting into Greece through the Bulgarian border, bypassing the fortified Metaxas line from the flank via mountain passes considered impassable. The British Expeditionary Corps, transferred from North Africa just a few weeks earlier specifically to support Greece, began an organized withdrawal almost immediately after the Germans broke through to Thessaloniki. On the Metaxas line, stretched along the Bulgarian border, individual Greek forts held out for several days after German tanks had already passed deep in their rear. The garrison simply had not received orders to retreat and continued to fire on roads that had long ceased to matter for the outcome of the campaign. The rearguard battles at Thermopylae in late April, fought by a New Zealand division, delayed the advance of German columns through the narrow mountain pass for several days, almost literally repeating the ancient topography of the battle 2,000 years prior, but they could not stop the offensive. The retreat turned into a kind of Dunkirk, only further south, in the mountains, and almost without press attention. The evacuation operation received the codename Demon.
By the end of April, about 50,000 soldiers of the British Commonwealth had been taken off the Greek coast and islands, but nearly 12,000 were killed, wounded, or captured, and almost all heavy equipment, tanks, guns, trucks, was left abandoned on the roads of the Peloponnese and in the port of Kalamata. The German command did not stop there. Some of the British, Australian, and New Zealand units evacuated from Greece withdrew to Crete, and just 3 weeks later, in late May, the island became the target of the largest airborne operation in the history of warfare up to that point. General Kurt Student's German paratroopers captured Maleme Airfield and the entire island, but paid perhaps the highest price of the entire Balkan campaign. Out of approximately 22,000 paratroopers, about 4,000 were killed, and the first waves of glider troops and paratroopers over Maleme were almost completely wiped out in the air and on the ground in the first hours of the landing. The Junkers 52 transport aircraft delivering the airborne forces burned by the dozens right on the airfields on the Greek coast. Crews did not even have time to unload the second echelon because the runway ahead was already littered with the wreckage of the previous sortie. One of the few surviving officers of the first wave later recalled that from his company, which jumped at dawn, less than a third remained in formation by the evening of the same day. The rest were killed before even reaching the ground, or were shot on the approach to the assembly point. After Crete, Hitler personally prohibited conducting large-scale airborne operations of such magnitude for the rest of the war. The victory had been so costly that he had no intention of repeating it. While fighting was still ongoing in Greece and Crete, the headquarters planning Operation Barbarossa were already counting not victories but days. The tank and motorized divisions transferred to the Balkans had to be returned to their starting positions on the Soviet border, undergo maintenance after days of marches along the mountain roads of Serbia and Macedonia, and be reintegrated into the offensive schedule drawn up back at the end of winter, before any coup in Belgrade. The 41st Motorized Corps, some of whose divisions had passed through the Balkan mountain passes, was to occupy its starting positions at the border by June, with worn-out tracks and engines that had not undergone full overhaul. General Franz Halder, Chief of the General Staff of the Army, noted several times in his work diary in the spring of 1941, with poorly concealed irritation, the disruptions to the troop transfer schedule from the south, and the lack of time for equipment restoration before the main campaign of the year. Individual divisions that left the Balkans as early as May moved under their own power through Hungarian and Romanian territory for hundreds of kilometers. Rather than being transported by rail, the capacity of the narrow mountain line simply could not handle the simultaneous transfer of such a quantity of equipment in the opposite direction. Repair companies, which were already in short supply, worked in shifts at intermediate stations, replacing worn-out tracks and overhauling engines right in the open air, because there were no permanent workshops along the route. The original date for the invasion of the Soviet Union, the 15th of May, was cancelled even before the fighting in Greece ended. The new date became the 22nd of June. Between these two dates lie exactly 5 weeks. 5 weeks that in popular post-war literature came to be called the Balkan Delay, and became one of the most persistent explanations for why German tanks did not reach Moscow before the onset of the autumn mud season and the first truly severe frosts. 5 weeks. Just 5 weeks separated the 15th of May from the 22nd of June. The 5 weeks that caused the advanced units of Army Group Center to reach the immediate approaches to Moscow, not at the end of October, but at the close of November and the beginning of December, when the thermometer in the Moscow region dropped below 30 degrees of frost, and German engines, not designed for such conditions, refused to start right on the starting positions for the final thrust.
By the beginning of December, advanced reconnaissance groups had come within several tens of kilometers of the capital's outskirts and stopped there forever. One German non-commissioned officer of a tank division, fighting near Moscow at that time, wrote home that the lubricant in the gunbolts froze so solid that the crews heated it with blowtorches right before each shot, and soldiers who had not received winter uniforms wrapped their feet in newspapers over their boots.
The summer offensive, designed to defeat the Soviet Union in a single campaign before the onset of cold weather, caught its own army without felt boots, without antifreeze for engines, and without experience of war at such temperatures, because according to the original schedule, the war should have already ended by December. Historians still debate how justified it is to link these 5 weeks specifically to the Balkans. American historian David Glantz and a number of other researchers point out that the spring of 1941 was unusually late and rainy on the eastern border. Rivers in Poland and the annexed territories flooded more than usual, and dirt roads remained impassable for heavy equipment until the first half of May. According to their calculations, the offensive would have had to be postponed by at least 2 to 3 weeks, regardless of whether the coup in Belgrade had happened or not. But even in this more cautious version, the Balkan Campaign took away at least a portion of the weeks that could not be made up later, and added to that the wear and tear of tank engines and tracks, battered by the mountain roads of Serbia and Macedonia just a month before the year's decisive campaign. British historian Corelli Barnett, in his works on the war in the East, took a much harsher position. In his estimation, without the Balkan diversion, the advanced German units had a real chance of approaching Moscow approximately a month earlier, before the rains and snowfalls turned the dirt roads into an impassable morass, and the mud season itself coincided not with a healthy, fully supplied army, but with troops who, 5 weeks earlier, were still repairing equipment on Balkan mountain passes instead of scheduled rest and major overhaul before the decisive thrust. Official German propaganda never acknowledged this connection. In the victorious reports of the summer of 1941, the Balkan Campaign was presented exclusively as a model of speed and superiority of the German war machine. 11 days against Yugoslavia, 3 weeks against Greece, victory on Crete, all this was listed alongside the initial successes in the East as a single chain of triumphs by the same army. Not a single report mentioned that some of the tank divisions assaulting Soviet fortifications in June had been undergoing maintenance after the Balkan Mountains just a month earlier, instead of preparing for the main campaign of that year. After the war, German generals writing memoirs, primarily those who had planned the Eastern Campaign in 1941, eagerly seized upon the version of the Balkan delay. It explained the failure of the drive on Moscow by external, almost accidental circumstances: the coup of an ally, the whim of Mussolini, who a year earlier had himself become bogged down in an unsuccessful offensive on Greece from Albania, and forced Germany to save the Italian front from complete collapse. This version proved convenient for everyone. It removed the question of their own miscalculations in planning the depth of the Eastern Campaign, assessing Soviet reserves, and the real capabilities of supplying columns stretched over thousands of kilometers. The 5 weeks became the official explanation for the defeat near Moscow, even before historians of the post-war decades had time to examine the other, far less convenient reasons, including the miscalculations of the General Staff itself, which began long before the coup in Belgrade. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, who commanded Army Group Center on the decisive Moscow axis, complained directly in his own war diary as early as May 1941 that part of the mobile formations allocated to him was being delayed in the south longer than planned, and the schedules for major overhauls of equipment were being disrupted one after another. After the war, giving testimony and writing memoirs, many generals of the same army group eagerly repeated the version of the Balkan delay as the main reason for the failure near Moscow, a version that removed the personal responsibility of the staffs for far less spectacular but no less significant miscalculations. Underestimation of Soviet mobilization reserves, supply lines stretched to the limit, and Hitler's decision in August to temporarily divert part of the tank forces south toward Kiev instead of a direct thrust on the capital. The West German Military History Research Office in post-war studies cautiously acknowledged the Balkan factor as one of several, but not the only one.
In the archival documents of Army Group Center headquarters from the spring of 1941, reports have been preserved about a shortage of spare parts for tank divisions precisely in those weeks when part of the equipment was still on the roads of Serbia, and not at assembly points near the border.
The soldiers, who 2 months later would be thrown into the snows near Moscow, in the spring were still slogging through the mud and dust of Balkan mountain passes, unaware that this campaign would become, for many of them, a prologue to a far more terrible winter. For Yugoslavia and Greece themselves, the price of these 5 weeks was measured in entirely different units. The occupation of the Balkans resulted in a partisan war that would tie down dozens of German divisions for years to come, punitive operations, and famine in cities deprived of pre-war supply routes. A quick victory on paper turned into a long, exhausting war on the ground, just as a quick victory over Yugoslavia on paper turned into a long, exhausting war near Moscow, only on the other side of the front and with entirely different casualty figures. The difference between these two figures is the true underside of the Balkan triumph. 11 days of victory, paid for with 5 weeks of someone else's schedule, which could not be rewritten back by anyone, neither Halder nor von Bock nor Hitler himself, no matter how fiercely he demanded in December 1941 to take Moscow at any cost. 11 days made headlines in 1941. 5 weeks decided far more than anyone in Berlin was willing to admit at the time. Hitler got the Balkans almost without resistance and, perhaps precisely for that reason, missed Moscow. Not because he lost a battle, but because he won too much time from some weeks and left himself too little for others.